In the span of a single tweet, a lifetime of work can vanish. In the echo chamber of digital judgment, a moment's misstep can become an eternal scarlet letter. The modern world has given birth to a phenomenon that can strip away careers, friendships, and peace of mind with the ruthless efficiency of a digital guillotine. We call it cancel culture. But the ancients knew it by another name, the mob's hunger for blood. Picture this: you wake up to a phone buzzing with notifications. Your mentions are flooded. Your name is trending, but not for any reason you'd want. Screenshots of something you said, something you did, something you believed, perhaps years ago, being dissected by thousands of strangers who have never met you, never heard your story, never walked in your shoes. Within hours, colleagues distance themselves, opportunities evaporate, and the life you built begins to crumble like a sandcastle before an unforgiving tide. This is the reality of our hyper-connected age, where judgment travels at the speed of light and mercy moves at the pace of continental drift, where context is sacrificed for clicks, nuance for narratives, and human complexity for the simple satisfaction of having someone to blame. In this digital coliseum, we are all potential gladiators, and the crowd's thumb can turn down at any moment. But what if I told you that over 2,000 years ago, philosophers faced this exact same human tendency, this same mob mentality, this same swift judgment, this same destruction of reputation and peace? What if I told you that in the marble halls of Rome and the agoras of Athens, wise men and women developed a philosophy so robust, so enduring, that it could weather any storm of public opinion? What if the answer to our modern crisis of character, assassination, lies not in the latest self-help trend or digital detox, but in the timeless wisdom of the Stoics? The Stoic philosophers understood something profound about human nature that we've forgotten in our rush to connect, to share, to judge, and to be judged. They understood that the opinion of the masses is as changeable as the wind, as reliable as a shadow, and as meaningful to your true worth as the number of likes on your latest post. They knew that in the theater of life, the audience will always demand a show, but the actor must choose whether to perform for their applause or for something far more enduring: cancel culture. At its essence is nothing new under the sun. It is the ancient practice of ostracism dressed in digital clothing. In ancient Athens, citizens could vote to exile their fellow citizens for 10 years without trial, simply because their presence had become inconvenient or threatening to the social order. The ostracized person had 10 days to leave the city, abandoning their property, their position, their entire life. They called it democracy in action. You might call it the original cancel culture. In Rome, it's the practice of damnatio memoria allowed the Senate to erase someone's existence from official records, chiseling their names from monuments, destroying their statues, and forbidding anyone from speaking their name. Imagine having your entire legacy wiped clean, as if you had never existed at all. Yet even in the face of such comprehensive destruction, some found the strength to endure, to maintain their dignity, to remember who they truly were beneath the labels others placed upon them. The Stoics lived in this world of political intrigue, social pressure, and public judgment. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire while being constantly criticized and questioned. Seneca navigated the treacherous waters of Nero's court, where a single wrong word could mean death. Epictetus was born slave, knowing that his very existence was subject to the whims of others. These men understood what it meant to be vulnerable to forces beyond their control, to have their reputations, their freedom, even their lives hanging by a thread. Yet from this crucible of uncertainty, they forged a philosophy of unshakable inner strength. They discovered that while we cannot control what others say about us, we can control how we respond. While we cannot determine whether we will be praised or condemned, we can determine whether we will remain true to our principles. While we cannot force the world to understand our intentions, we can ensure that our intentions remain pure and our actions remain virtuous. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his private journal that would later become the Meditations, reminded himself daily that the opinions of others are external to his essential being. How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, he wrote, but only to what he does himself. In the quiet moments before dawn, as he prepared to face another day of criticism and praise, of political maneuvering and public scrutiny, he anchored himself in a simple truth. The only reputation that truly matters is the one you have with yourself. This is not the advice of a man who lived in isolation, protected from the harsh realities of public life. This is the wisdom of someone who ruled the known world, who made decisions that affected millions, who understood that every choice would be scrutinized, every action debated, every word dissected by historians for centuries to come. If anyone had reason to be paralyzed by the fear of judgment, it was Marcus Aurelius. Yet he chose to focus not on how history would remember him, but on how he could serve virtue in each present moment. Seneca faced an even more precarious situation. As advisor to Nero, he walked a tightrope between maintaining his influence for good and avoiding the emperor's notorious wrath. His letters to his friend Lucilius reveal a man constantly aware that his position could vanish overnight, that his words could be twisted, that his enemies were always watching for any sign of weakness or disloyalty. Yet rather than becoming paranoid or defensive, Seneca used this uncertainty as a training ground for philosophical resilience. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, Seneca observed. Understanding that even the most devastating loss of reputation or position is simply another chapter in the ongoing story of a life lived according to principle. He taught that we must hold our external circumstances lightly, like a guest who knows they are visiting someone else's house. Our reputation, our career, our social standing, these are all temporary lodgings. It's not our permanent home. When the mob finally came for Seneca, when Nero ordered him to commit suicide on charges of treason, the philosopher faced his end with the same calm dignity with which he had faced criticism throughout his life. His final act was not one of bitterness or revenge, but of teaching, as he calmly explained the principles of Stoicism to his friends, while the poison did its work. He understood that how he died would speak louder than any defense he could have offered to the charges against him, but perhaps no Stoic understood the dynamics of powerlessness and social judgment better than Epictetus. Born into slavery, he experienced firsthand what it means to have no control over how others perceive you, treat you, or speak about you. His master could have had him executed for any reason or no reason at all. His fellow slaves could have turned against him out of jealousy or fear. His freedom depended entirely on forces beyond his control. Yet from this position of ultimate vulnerability, Epictetus developed insights into human dignity that remain revolutionary to this day. He taught that no one can truly hurt you without your permission, that your worth is not determined by your circumstances, but by your character, and that the person who tries to destroy your reputation says more about themselves than they do about you. Wealth consists in not having great possessions, Epictetus taught, but in having few wants. This principle extends far beyond material wealth to include the wealth of reputation and social approval. The person who needs constant validation from others, who measures their worth by their popularity or influence, will always be at the mercy of forces beyond their control. But the person who finds their validation in the alignment of their actions with their principles will possess a wealth that no mob can take away. When we examine these ancient examples through the lens of modern cancel culture, certain patterns emerge. The person being canceled today faces the same fundamental choice that the ostracized Athenian, the condemned Roman, and the enslaved Greek faced. Will they allow external judgment to define their inner reality, or will they maintain their essential dignity regardless of how others choose to see them? The Stoics understood that reputation is like the weather, sometimes sunny, sometimes stormy, but always changing and always beyond our direct control. We can prepare for bad weather by building strong character, just as we can prepare for criticism by developing philosophical resilience, but we cannot make it rain or shine on command. The farmer who spends all day staring at the sky, worrying about the weather, neglects the work of cultivation that is actually within his power. This perspective transforms how we approach the experience of being criticized or canceled. Instead of seeing it as a catastrophic failure or an irreversible destruction of our life's work, can view it as the Stoics viewed any external challenge as an opportunity to practice virtue under pressure. Marcus Aurelius called obstacles fuel for the fire, understanding that resistance makes us stronger and criticism can clarify our values. When facing a social media storm or public criticism, the first Stoic principle to remember is the fundamental distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us. We cannot control what others say about us, but we can control how we respond. We cannot control whether people choose to believe rumors or half-truths, but we can control whether we act with integrity moving forward. We cannot control whether opportunities disappear, but we can control whether we use this time of difficulty to grow in wisdom and character. This is not passive resignation or hopeless acceptance. The Stoics were not advocates for simply lying down and taking abuse. Rather, they understood that effective response comes from a place of inner strength, not reactive emotion. The person who responds to criticism with anger, defensiveness, or revenge is still being controlled by external forces. But the person who responds with calm reflection, genuine self-examination, and continued commitment to virtue maintains their freedom regardless of circumstances. Seneca faced criticism for his wealth while preaching philosophy, for his association with Nero while advocating for virtue, for his writing style, and for his past mistakes. Rather than ignoring these criticisms or attacking his critics, he engaged in rigorous self-examination. He asked himself honestly whether there was truth in what his enemies said. When there was, he worked to improve. And there wasn't, continued on his chosen path without bitterness or resentment. This practice of self-examination in the face of criticism is perhaps the most difficult and most valuable skill a Stoic develops. It requires the intellectual honesty to admit when we have made mistakes, the emotional maturity to separate valid criticism from personal attacks, and the wisdom to know when to change course and when to stay the path. It's far easier to dismiss all criticism as unfair or to accept all criticism as deserved. But true wisdom lies in the careful work of discernment. The Stoics also understood that criticism often says more about the critic than the criticized. Epictetus taught that when someone insults you, they are not describing your character, but revealing their own. The person who needs to tear others down to feel important, who delights in the suffering of others, who spreads rumors or half-truths for entertainment, is displaying their own inner poverty. Understanding this doesn't make the criticism less painful, but it does help us see it in proper perspective, Marcus Aurelius wrote. How much trouble he avoids who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does, but only to what he does himself. This doesn't mean we should ignore feedback or live in isolation. Rather, that our primary focus should always be on our own character and conduct. The person who spends all their energy monitoring their reputation, defending themselves against every slight, and seeking approval from every critic will have no energy left for the actual work of living virtuously. This internal focus requires developing what the Stoics called emotional detachment. This is not the detachment of indifference or coldness, but the detachment of perspective. When we are emotionally entangled with others' opinions, we cannot think clearly or act wisely. We become reactive rather than responsive, defensive rather than reflective, bitter rather than growth-oriented. Seneca practiced emotional detachment by regularly imagining the loss of everything he valued: his position, his wealth, his reputation, even his life. This was not morbid pessimism, but realistic preparation. By accepting in advance that all external goods are temporary, he freed himself from the anxiety of potentially losing them and the desperate need to cling to them when they were threatened. When criticism comes, emotional detachment allows us to receive it without our ego becoming involved. We can ask ourselves, is this criticism accurate? What can I learn from it? How can I use this experience to grow in virtue? These questions are impossible to answer clearly when we are in the grip of shame, anger, or fear. But when we maintain proper distance from our emotional reactions, we we can engage with criticism as a tool for self-improvement rather than a weapon being used against us. The Stoics also practice what they called the discipline of desire, which involves wanting what happens rather than demanding that what we want should happen. This doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up our goals, but rather holding our preferences lightly and remaining open to different outcomes than we initially planned. When applied to cancel culture, this discipline allows us to see criticism or social rejection not as a catastrophic derailment of our life plan, but as a redirection that might lead to unexpected opportunities. History is full of people whose greatest contributions came after they were rejected by their contemporaries. Artists whose work was too innovative for its time, the scientist whose theories challenged accepted wisdom. The reformer whose ideas were ahead of their era all faced criticism and social rejection that ultimately proved to be the catalyst for their most important work. Marcus Aurelius was criticized for spending too much time on philosophy instead of military conquest, for being too lenient with his enemies, for failing to live up to the image of the warrior emperor. Yet today he is remembered not for his military victories but for his philosophical insights. The very qualities that his critics saw as weaknesses became his greatest legacy. He understood that immediate approval and historical significance often move in opposite directions. This perspective requires developing what the Stoics called the long view. Daily fluctuations in reputation, temporary setbacks, and even major public controversies are brief moments in a much larger story. The person who lives for today's headlines will be devastated by tomorrow's criticism, but the person who keeps their eyes fixed on their long-term character development will weather temporary storms with equanimity. The long view also includes understanding we are part of a much larger human story that extends far beyond our individual lives. The Stoics believed in the interconnectedness of all human experience and the importance of contributing to the common good. When we face criticism or rejection, we can ask ourselves, how can this experience serve something larger than my personal comfort or reputation? What can I learn that might help others facing similar challenges? How can I use this difficulty to develop virtues that will serve the broader human community? This cosmic perspective prevents us from taking personal attacks too personally. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the universe is change, and our lives are what our thoughts make it. The person who attacks us today might praise us tomorrow. The crowd that condemns us this year might celebrate us the next. The only constant is change itself, and the only reliable foundation is the character we build through consistent, virtuous action. Seneca taught that we must learn to find our security not in others' opinions but in our own integrity. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, he wrote. Understanding that even total social rejection could become the foundation for a new and better life. When we stop trying to please everyone, we free ourselves to serve our deepest values. When we stop fearing others' judgment, we can finally listen to our own moral compass. This doesn't mean ignoring feedback or refusing to acknowledge when we've made mistakes. The Stoics valued honest self-examination and were quick to admit errors and make corrections. But they distinguished between productive feedback that helps them grow and destructive criticism that aims only to harm. They welcomed the first and remained unmoved by the second. The practice of forgiveness is central to the Stoic response to cancel culture, but not in the way most people understand forgiveness. The Stoics didn't forgive because they felt their attackers deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to anger and resentment was harmful to their own peace of mind and character development. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy. Responding to cruelty with cruelty, to dishonesty with dishonesty, to hatred with hatred only perpetuates the very behaviors we claim to oppose." Epictetus taught that forgiveness is ultimately about freedom. Our freedom from being controlled by others' actions and attitudes. When we hold grudges, we give our peace of mind over to people who have hurt us. We allow them to continue causing us pain long after the initial incident has passed. Forgiveness is not about excusing harmful behavior, but about refusing to let that behavior continue to harm us internally. This philosophical approach to forgiveness extends to forgiving ourselves as well. Cancel culture often involves dredging up past mistakes, and demanding that people be forever defined by their worst moments. The Stoics understood that human beings are constantly growing and changing, that today's wisdom was often yesterday's folly, and that moral progress requires the freedom to learn from mistakes without being permanently condemned for them. Seneca was acutely aware of his own moral failings and wrote extensively about the gap between philosophical ideals and human reality. He didn't use his imperfections as an excuse to abandon his principles, nor did he pretend to have achieved moral perfection. Instead, he saw his failures as part of the ongoing work of character development. Every day and every hour ought to strip some folly from us, he wrote. Understanding that moral growth is a lifelong process that requires both high standards and patience with our inevitable shortcomings. This compassionate realism is essential for surviving cancel culture with our sanity and integrity intact. The person who believes they must be perfect to deserve basic human dignity will be devastated when their imperfections are exposed. But the person who accepts their humanity while continuing to strive for virtue will have the resilience to acknowledge mistakes, make amends where possible, continue growing without being paralyzed by shame or self-dashed hatred. The Stoics also understood the importance of community and mentorship in developing this kind of philosophical resilience. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the teachers and role models who shaped his character. Understanding that we cannot develop virtue in isolation, Seneca's letters to Lucilius demonstrate the power of philosophical friendship, relationships based on mutual commitment to growth rather than simple enjoyment or convenience. In facing cancel culture, it's crucial to distinguish between the mob mentality of social media and the genuine community of people who know us deeply and care about our long-term flourishing. The former offers the intoxication of immediate validation but disappears at the first sign of controversy. The latter provides the steady support needed for authentic growth and recovery from public criticism. Building this kind of philosophical community requires vulnerability and mutual commitment. We must be willing to show our struggles and imperfections. Two people who will challenge us to grow rather than simply affirm our existing beliefs. We must seek out mentors who have weathered similar storms and can offer wisdom born from experience. We must also be willing to serve as mentors ourselves, understanding that teaching others helps solidify our own learning. The Stoics believed that philosophy was not an abstract intellectual exercise, but a practical set of tools for living well under any circumstances. They developed specific practices for maintaining equanimity in the face of criticism, loss, and social pressure. These practices, refined over centuries of testing in the crucible of real-world difficulty, offer concrete steps for anyone facing the modern equivalent of ancient ostracism. The practice of morning reflection involves starting each day by reminding ourselves of our core principles and preparing mentally for the challenges we might face. Marcus Aurelius used his morning routine to remember that other people's opinions are external to his essential being, that his worth comes from his character rather than his circumstances, and that every difficulty is an opportunity to practice virtue. By grounding himself in these truths before engaging with the world, built the mental resilience needed to face criticism without being derailed by it. Evening reflection involves reviewing the day's events with honest self-examination, celebrating moments when we acted in accordance with our principles, and learning from moments when we fell short. This practice prevents us from either becoming complacent about our character development or being consumed by guilt over our mistakes. It keeps us focused on continuous improvement rather than perfect performance. The practice of negative visualization involves regularly imagining the loss of external goods' reputation, career, relationships, not to become pessimistic, but to reduce our emotional attachment to things beyond our control. By accepting in advance that these losses are possible, we free ourselves from the anxiety of potentially losing them and develop gratitude for what we currently have. The practice of philosophical discourse involves regularly engaging with texts and conversations that challenge our thinking and broaden our perspective. This prevents us from becoming intellectually isolated or emotionally reactive to ideas that differ from our own. It also builds the mental flexibility needed to distinguish between criticism that deserves consideration and attacks that deserve dismissal. Perhaps most importantly, the Stoics practice what they call the discipline of action, which involves focusing our energy on what we can actually influence rather than what we wish we could control. In the context of cancel culture, this means putting our effort into living according to our principles rather than managing our image, into serving our community rather than defending our reputation, to growing in character rather than proving our innocence. The Stoics understood that a life spent primarily in reaction to others' opinions is not really a life at all, but a kind of slavery to external forces. True freedom comes from aligning our actions with our deepest values, regardless of whether those actions are popular or unpopular, praised or criticized, understood or misunderstood. This is not the freedom of selfishness or indifference to others' well-being, but the freedom of authentic service. When we stop trying to please everyone, we can focus on serving those causes and people that matter most to us. When we stop fearing criticism, we can take the risks necessary for meaningful contribution. When we stop measuring our worth by others' approval, we can offer the best of ourselves without reservation. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where reputation could be destroyed overnight, where political winds shifted without warning, where today's hero could become tomorrow's villain. Yet they developed a philosophy of such enduring wisdom that it continues to offer guidance to people facing similar challenges to millennia later. Their secret was not avoiding criticism or controversy, but learning to remain centered in their deepest values, regardless of external circumstances. In our hyper-connected age, we have the opportunity to rediscover this ancient wisdom and adapt it to contemporary challenges. The tools are the same: rigorous self-examination, emotional detachment, focus on what we can control, commitment to virtue regardless of consequences. But the stakes may be even higher as the speed and scale of modern communication can amplify both criticism and its effects far beyond what the ancients could have imagined. Yet this also means that the wisdom we develop in facing cancel culture with dignity and grace can serve as an example to countless others who are watching, learning, and struggling with similar challenges. Every person who chooses to respond to hatred with understanding, to criticism with self-reflection, to ostracism with continued commitment to service, becomes a teacher for others who are seeking a better way. The Stoics believe that we are all part of a larger human community, that our individual struggles and triumphs contribute to the overall progress of human wisdom and virtue. When we face cancel culture like a Stoic, we are not just protecting our own peace of mind, but contributing to a cultural shift toward greater wisdom, compassion, and resilience. This is perhaps the greatest gift we can give to a world caught between the ancient human tendency toward mob mentality and the modern tools that make such behavior more powerful and pervasive than ever before. We can demonstrate that there is another way, a path of dignity, growth, and service that remains available to anyone regardless of their circumstances or the opinions of their contemporaries. The Stoic who faces cancel culture does not seek to become immune to criticism or indifferent to others' suffering, but rather to develop the inner strength needed to serve something greater than their own comfort or reputation. They understand that reputation is like the shadow we cast, sometimes long, sometimes short, sometimes invisible, but never identical to the substance that creates it. Our character, our principles, our commitment to virtue, these are the substance, and they remain intact regardless of how others choose to perceive or portray them. In the end, the question is not whether we will face criticism, judgment, or social pressure in our lives, but how we will respond when these inevitable challenges arise. Will we be like the reed that bends with every wind, constantly adjusting our principles to match popular opinion? Will we be like the oak that refuses to bend and eventually breaks under pressure? Or will we be like the Stoic philosopher, rooted deeply in virtue, but flexible enough to learn, grow, and adapt, while never abandoning our core commitment to living with dignity and wisdom? The ancient Stoics faced their challenges with remarkable grace, not because they were superhuman or immune to pain, but because they had learned to find their meaning in something deeper than temporary approval or disapproval. They understood that a life lived in service to virtue, truth, and human flourishing would always face opposition from those who prefer comfort to growth, conformity to authenticity, and easy answers to difficult questions. But they also understood that such a life, regardless of its external rewards or punishments, would be a life worth living. In the quiet moments before dawn, in the final accounting of a life well lived, what matters is not what others thought of us, but what we made of ourselves. The Stoic who faces cancel culture carries this knowledge like a flame that no wind of criticism can extinguish, and that flame becomes a light for others walking the same difficult path toward wisdom. Courage and peace. This is the timeless gift of Stoic philosophy, not the promise of an easy life or universal approval, but the assurance that we can face any storm with dignity intact and purpose undisturbed. In a world that often seems designed to tear us down, this ancient wisdom offers us the tools to build ourselves up from the inside out, creating lives of meaning and service that no mob can cancel and no criticism can destroy.